Charles Groves Wright Anderson, VCMC, was a South African-born soldier, Australian recipient of the Victoria Cross, a member of the Australian House of Representatives, and a farmer. After growing up in Africa and being schooled in England, Anderson served as an officer during the East African campaign against the Germans during the First World War, reaching the rank of captain and being awarded the Military Cross. After the war, Anderson settled as a farmer in Kenya. In the early 1930s, he married an Australian woman and later moved to Australia, where he became a grazier. In 1939, he joined the militia, Australia's part-time military force, before volunteering for overseas service after the outbreak of the Second World War. In early 1941, he was deployed to Malaya as part of the 8th Division, where he rose to command the 19th Battalion against the Japanese following their invasion of Malaya in December of that year. For his actions around MUAR in January 1942, he was awarded the Victoria Cross before being captured at the end of the fighting on Singapore. He spent over 3 years in Japanese captivity, before being released at the end of the war. In the post-war years, Anderson returned to farming and served as a federal parliamentarian, representing the division of Hume twice between 1949 and 1961, before retiring. He died in Canberra at the age of 91. Early life. Anderson was born on the 12th of February 1897 in Cape Town, South Africa, to Scottish parents. His father, Alfred Gerald Wright Anderson, an auditor and newspaper editor, had been born in England, while his mother, Emma Louise Antoinette, Trosset, had been born in Belgium. The middle child of 5, when Anderson was 3, the family moved to Nairobi in Kenya, where his father began farming. He attended a local school until 1907, when his parents sent him to England. He lived with family members until 1910, when he was accepted to attend St Brendan's College in Bristol as a boarder. He remained in England until the outbreak of the First World War. Returning to Kenya in November 1914, Anderson enlisted as a soldier in the local forces, before later being allocated to the Calcutta Volunteer Battalion as a gunner. On the 13th of October 1916, he was commissioned as a lieutenant in the King's African Rifles. He fought with the regiment's 3rd Battalion in the East African campaign against the Askari soldiers of the German colonial forces. Anderson was awarded the Military Cross for his service in this campaign. Following the war, having reached the rank of temporary captain, Anderson was demobilized in February 1919 and lived the life of a gentleman farmer in Kenya, marrying Edith Tout, an Australian, in February 1931. He remained active as a part-time soldier and was promoted to substantive captain in 1932. 2 years later the couple moved to Australia, where they purchased a grazing property near Young, New South Wales. He joined the Citizens Military Forces in March 1939, being appointed to the 56th Infantry Battalion as a captain. Following the outbreak of the Second World War, Anderson was temporarily promoted to the rank of Major in October 1939. In June 1940, he volunteered for overseas service by joining the 2nd Australian Imperial Force. Second World War. In July 1940, Anderson was assigned to the newly formed 19th Infantry Battalion, part of the 22nd Brigade of the 8th Division, recruited from New South Wales after training around Ingleburn and then Bathurst. In February 1941, the 22nd Brigade was deployed to Malaya to bolster the garrison there amidst concerns about Japanese intentions in the region. Holding the rank of major. Anderson was appointed second in command of the battalion, and due to his experience in jungle warfare, he was placed in charge of training the battalion soldiers to use the jungle as a friend. In August he was promoted to lieutenant colonel and took over as commanding officer of the 219th. The war in the Pacific began on the 7th of December 1941 when Japanese landed on the northeast coast of Malaya around Kota Baru and launched thrusts along the western coast of the Malay Peninsula from Thailand. Initially the 219th was not committed to the fighting, but in mid-January, after the Japanese advance had pushed the British Commonwealth troops back to Johor, the 219th was detached from the 22nd Brigade and sent to the west coast to support the hard-pressed battalions of West Force, an ad hoc formation consisting of Australian and Indian troops. During the period of 18 to 22 January 1942, in the Battle of Muar near the Muar River, the 44-year-old Anderson was in command of a small force which destroyed 10 enemy tanks. When they were later cut off, Anderson led his force through 15 miles of enemy-occupied territory, being attacked by air and ground forces all the way. Many times in the journey from Muar to Parit Sulong, Anderson had to lead bayonet charges and hand-to-hand combat against the Japanese. Anderson is famous for leading the Allied attack in Parit Sulong against the Japanese when the Allies were retreating to Yongpeng to meet up with the main force heading for Singapore. Upon reaching the small town of Parit Sulong on the way, they discovered the way blocked because the main bridge was already in Japanese hands, with a Japanese machine gun defending the bridge. They were surrounded and a heavy battle ensued for several days in Parit Sulong. The Allied troops at Yongpeng under Gordon Bennett unsuccessfully attempted to break through the Japanese lines to reinforce Anderson's men, but without reinforcements, Anderson and his troops had to try many times to recapture the bridge but was unable to do so. Heavily outnumbered, Anderson's Australian and Indian troops were attacked and harassed continuously by Japanese tanks, machine gun, mortar and air attacks and suffered heavy casualties. Yet they held their position for several days and refused to surrender. During the battle, Anderson had tried to evacuate the wounded by using an ambulance, but the Japanese would not let the vehicles pass the bridge. Although the detachment attempted to fight its way through another 8 miles of enemy-occupied territory to Yongpeng, this proved impossible, and Anderson had to destroy his equipment and attempted to work his way around the enemy. Anderson then ordered every able man to escape through the jungle to link up with the retreating main force in Yongpeng heading for Singapore. They had no choice but to leave the wounded to be cared for by the enemy, assuming the Japanese would take care of the wounded. But unfortunately, the Japanese unit at Parit Sulong later executed the approximately 150 wounded Australian soldiers and Indian soldiers next to the bridge of Parit Sulong. In the Parit Sulong massacre, for his brave actions and leadership in Muar and the difficult retreat from Muar to Parit Sulong and the subsequent difficult battle at Parit Sulong, led by Anderson, he was awarded the highest and most prestigious decoration for gallantry in the face of the enemy that could be awarded to British Commonwealth forces. His VC citation, as listed in the London Gazette on 13 February 1942, states, "For setting a magnificent example of brave leadership, determination and outstanding courage, he not only showed fighting qualities of very high order but throughout exposed himself to danger without any regard for his own personal safety." Following the action around Muar and Parit Sulong, Anderson went to Singapore. As the Allies withdrew across the causeway to prepare a line of defense, shortly Shortly afterwards he was hospitalized and, as a result, missed the majority of the fighting following the Japanese landings on 8 February 1942. As the situation became desperate, on 13 February, Anderson discharged himself and returned to the heavily mauled 19th, by then down to just 180 men from its authorized strength of 900. He led them until the surrender was announced 2 days later. Anderson was captured and for the next 3 years was held as a prisoner of war. He was the chief staff officer under Brigadier Arthur Varley of the 22nd Brigade in a force, the first contingent of PAS at Chungi to voluntarily avail themselves of a Japanese offer to move to a new location where they were told there would be abundant food and a healthy climate. In reality, the group of 3,000 were shipped to Burma and were used as slave labor to build the 415 kilometers railway link between Nong Pladuk in Thailand and Thanbi Uzayut in Burma. Throughout his time in captivity, Anderson worked to mitigate the hardships of other prisoners, leading by personal example and maintaining morale. At the end of the war, Anderson was repatriated back to Australia. His appointment in the army was terminated on the 21st of December 1945 and he returned to his property in New South Wales. Later life. Charles Anderson entered politics in 1949, winning the division of Hume as a representative of the Country Party with an 18.8% swing. He lost his House of Representatives seat in the 1951 federal election, unsuccessfully stood for Hume at the 1954 election before regaining the seat in 1955, and remaining in Parliament until his defeat at the 1961 election. While in Parliament, Anderson served as a member of the Joint Committee on the Australian Capital Territory, and also for Foreign Affairs. Between 1957 and 1960, although he was retired from active military service, Anderson fulfilled the role of Honorary Colonel of the 4th and 56th Battalions. Anderson owned farming properties around Young, New South Wales, and following his retirement from politics in 1961, moved permanently to Red Hill in Canberra, where he died in 1988. He was survived by 3 of his 4 children. There is a memorial stone and plaque for Anderson at Norwood Crematorium, Australian Capital Territory. His Victoria Cross is displayed at the Australian War Memorial, Canberra, Australia. Honours and awards.